Well, that's actually tomorrow during Sunday school. You may not go to this church. You're welcome to come, I'm sure, tomorrow. But tomorrow during Sunday school, what time is the Sunday school tomorrow? 9:30. So I'm going to be speaking in here about misconceptions about the origins of the New Testament canon. And there I will get into a bit more of the historical evidence. And then, of course, I'll be preaching. Now, obviously, as he said, you're more than welcome to take one of the books on the way out. And I get into a lot of the historical evidences there. And I hope you get a chance to look at that and benefit from that. Okay, so let's jump into our first session tonight about how to survive Religion 101 at college. And I want to run through a number of things tonight that I hope for helpful pieces of advice for you as you think about this. Before we go there, though, I want to begin with my own story. In fact, this story is so seared in my head that I can actually still remember the feeling I had in my stomach at a particular moment in time many years ago when I was a freshman at UNC Chapel Hill. I can still remember it was the very first day of religion class. I was in a class called Introduction to the New Testament. Here I was at a big secular university, UNC. I was a committed believer, grew up in a Christian home. I got there thinking, oh, well, I'm a Christian. I'll be fine here. Nothing to worry about. And I found myself in this religion class. In the very opening lecture, the professor starts talking about a figure in the ancient world. Our professor says, let me tell you about a man who lived in the Mediterranean world in the first century. He traveled around and did miracles. He had a little band of followers. And he did incredible things. Then he was betrayed by some of those followers, and he was killed, and later he rose from the dead. And his name was, and I, taking notes dutifully, wrote down the word Jesus on the page. And then the professor said, and his name was Apollonius of Tyana. And I was like, what? You mean it's not Jesus? And I could tell right then that the professor had set up this little introduction to make you think he was talking about Jesus. But then actually he's talking about another Mediterranean figure in the ancient Near Eastern world by the name of Apollonius of Tyana, who actually has a life remarkably similar to Jesus's, who was claimed to have done similar things and had his own little band of followers and even seemed to have died and risen back from the dead. And of course, his whole point was simply this. You think you know about Christianity, but you really don't. You really think that Christianity is unique, and it really isn't. And that first day, I can remember that growing pit. And you ever have a feeling like you're almost going to throw up, and you're like, what is happening? I never heard that before. Why didn't I ever get told that by my pastor or my youth leader? Of course, that was just the beginning. For the next entire semester, this particular professor began to sort of tear apart just about everything I believed about the New Testament Gospels, telling us that they were, basically forgeries written by somebody who wasn't one of the disciples, telling us that they weren't transmitted reliably, and scribes changed the text thousands of times, and how you can't really trust much of anything about Jesus in these books, and on it went. Now, as distraught as I was in the middle of all this, I didn't have an answer. I'm 18 years old. I also watched the effect on other people in the class. Some people pretended sort of it's not happening. Ever know anyone like that? You have a challenge with their faith, and it's like, I'm going to pretend this isn't happening, so my faith's over here, and intellectual things are over there, and I'm never going to let the two touch each other. So I'm impervious to any challenges. So some people responded that way. Other people were like, oh yeah, I've been waiting to hear this my whole life. It's not true. Great, I'll go live however I want, right? And then there were some people who were trying to mesh the two together. And then there I was trying to figure out what I was going to do. Well, I decided that whatever objections I was hearing to the Bible, surely there's answers to these. Couldn't be the first time anyone's ever raised these objections. So I decided I would go and begin to look into the historical evidence for myself and find out if what I was hearing in class was in fact real. And that took me on a journey, not only through undergrad, but then through seminary, then PhD work, and then, of course, a professor at RTS for the last 23 years. Now, at the time, I didn't realize that the professor that I've been describing would become one of the most famous critics of Christianity in modern biblical scholarship. That was a professor by the name of Bart Ehrman. You may know Dr. Ehrman's name. He now lectures still at UNC and all over the world, and he's written many best-selling books telling you why there's no reason to think the Bible's true and why you can't trust the Gospels. And I didn't realize it at the time that I was sitting under this guy. He was yet to be well-known. As he attacked the Bible. Now, I know, and you know, that my experience is not unique. Whether it's Ehrman or somebody else, every college student goes off to school and they get told things they're not ready for. So how do you survive a religion class? How do you survive as a student in college? Now, there's different ways to take attack on this. One thing I could do tonight is I could say, let me just dump on you every piece of historical evidence I have. And for the next 3 hours, I could give you this long set of lectures and just put data on you. Well, that might have some value, and some of you may remember a few things. If you want more data, history stuff, come back tomorrow. What I want to do is I just want to lay out some principles, some advice, some concepts, some biblical wisdom tonight. I extrapolate more on this in my book of what I think needs to happen in your life if you're going to survive that time in college. So we're going to walk through very quickly, in this first session, it won't be long. I'm going to walk through 6 things I want you to think about as you think about surviving what it takes to survive Religion 101. And then in the second talk, like I said, I'm going to back up the tape a little bit, and we're going to talk about what do you do before you go? How do you think about it, particularly as a family or as a younger person, before you go out the door? All right, so let's lay out 6 things that I think are going to be important for you to survive Religion 101, whether you're a college student currently or maybe right on the cusp. Let me just start through the 6. Here's the first. Take this transition seriously. Lesson number 1, take this transition seriously. Now, I've spoken a good bit on this topic all over the country, and certainly I'm interacted in a lot of podcasts from my book and the other books I've written. And one reaction I get is pretty common. Some folks say, well, isn't this whole sort of, college is going to chew your kids up thing a little bit overblown? Aren't we just making a little bit of a mountain out of a molehill here? Isn't it true that many Christians go off to college and have wonderful spiritual experiences and they actually grow while they're in college? And isn't it true that also some professors at these secular schools are actually believers themselves, and don't they have great fellowships on campus? Aren't we just sort of scaring parents here by telling them that their kids are going to go off and abandon the faith? And I hear that a lot, and I think there's some fairness to that concern. And certainly one thing I don't want you to take away tonight, and certainly I don't want you to take it away if you ever read my book, is this idea that college is the darkness of abyss, and if you go into it, you're likely 99% chance you're going to lose your faith, or some crazy stat like this. I don't want you to go to college sort of with what I call a martyr complex. Everyone's out to get me. No one likes Christians. Everyone's part of the Inquisition looking to string me up. Every professor's Darth Vader, and on it goes. And so people go to college with this mentality. And you understand why. Sometimes you grow up in a church context where you're a little bit bubbled in. We all have this tendency, and the world out there seems kind of scary, and when we go into it, we're very sort of nervous about it, and there can be almost this war mentality. I certainly don't want that to be the case. No one needs to go off to college sort of, guns out of the holster, metaphorically speaking, always ready for a fight at every moment, fearing that everybody's out to get you. That doesn't make a person a very pleasant person to be around, and is unlikely to make friends for you when you get to college. But there's also another problem, and it's the opposite, and I see this too. It's people who grow up in a Christian home and think, oh, I'm a believer, I got nothing to worry about. My parents taught me the gospel, and I grew up in a Bible-believing church, and what's all the hubbub about? I don't need to worry about this college thing. And so people step into the environment of a university maybe a little overconfident, maybe a little naive, maybe a little bit thinking, oh, whatever comes my way, I'm perfectly ready to handle it, nothing to worry about here. But then if you just stop and think about that for a moment, you're like, well, really? So at 18 years old, there's nothing that can shake your faith? At 18, there's nothing you could hear that might challenge you? At 18, you have all the maturity you need to not have to worry about ever struggling with what you know to be true? No, not at all. And so what I want to encourage you is that on one side, not to have the martyr complex when you go off to college, but on the flip side, not to dismiss this as irrelevant. This is a serious transition, and it's one that you want to make sure you take seriously. There are challenges, there are pitfalls, there are all things ahead of you that you don't even know yet, what you've not seen. And I can still remember, if I felt that way when I was at school, I know that everybody at some level or another is going to have a moment similar to that where they have to wonder, do I really believe what I believe, or do I believe it just because my parents taught it to me? Is it really true, or is it just something I grew up with? What if I'd grown up in Saudi Arabia? Maybe I'd be convinced that Islam was true. What if I grew up in China? Maybe I'd become a Buddhist. I mean, is it all just random? You're going to have these questions. So first step out of all these steps is just don't underestimate the challenges. Take it seriously. Kind of reminds me of a line from one of my favorite books, Fellowship of the Ring, which is, of course, the story of Lord of the Rings, the first of the three. And in it, Bilbo is giving his little nephew Frodo some advice. And here's the advice he gives him. Bilbo says to Frodo, "It's a dangerous business going out your door. You step into the road, and if you don't keep your feet, there's no knowing where you might be swept off to." It's interesting advice because Frodo was always ready for an adventure, and Bilbo's like, yeah, sometimes adventures don't turn out the way you think. If you step out the door, you better be ready. It's a dangerous business on the road if you don't know where you're going. So my first piece of advice here is simply do what the Bible says. There's a phrase for this. Paul uses it in 1 Corinthians 16. Spiritually speaking, be on your guard. It's that simple. Don't think everyone's out to get you. Don't be super defensive, but also at the same time, don't be naive about the challenge that you're going to face. Okay, here's the second thing tonight in our first talk in terms of surviving religion 101. And it's a second piece of advice, actually a second exhortation. It's simply this: you won't have all the answers. I can tell you in advance, you won't have all the answers. In fact, what will happen in college is probably something a lot like this. You'll get to a college scenario and you'll be on your hall in the dorm, or you'll be in a sort of gathering in your class or after class, and there'll be a debate about something. There'll be a question that's asked, some sort of exchange. Maybe it's about why there's so much evil in the world if we serve a good God. Wouldn't he stop it if he could? Maybe it's an exchange about the Bible. Why would you trust a book written by men? Copied and copied over thousands of years, changed many, many times. Why would you believe a story about all of the human race originating with two people, Adam and Eve, when we all know genetically that the world didn't go back to just two people, but many people? Why would you believe any of these things? Then you have a little exchange in the dorm room, on the hallway, in the classroom, and you find out that they ask you questions you don't have answers to. This will happen. It'll happen many times where you just hear something you never heard before. You just realize you don't even know what that is that they're talking about. Or they bring up an objection that you don't have any rebuttal to. And in a university environment, that can be a little embarrassing. It can be a little bit like, okay, well, I kind of got, I kind of lost that certain theological exchange or what have you. But here's what tends to happen in some people's minds. They think that if you don't have an answer to a tough question, that maybe what you believe is false. You wouldn't believe how many times I've had this conversation with people. They're starting to doubt their faith. I'm like, well, why are you doubting your faith? Well, I had this conversation. They asked me a question I couldn't answer. And I'm thinking, that's the reason? I mean, I want to in the second point, just dial that back for a moment and say that I think that's not a reason to doubt your faith, just simply having a situation where you don't have an answer. You won't have the answer, but many places you don't have an answer. And here's the thing I want you to realize. Not having an answer does not affect the truth of what you believe. You can be right about what you believe even if you can't answer objections to it. You can be right about what you believe even if you don't understand everything someone's saying. In fact, most of life is like this if you haven't thought about it. We hold many beliefs that could in fact be true and often are, even if you can't explain them or defend them. I would imagine most of you probably believe that that humans landed on the moon in 1969. We just celebrated that not long ago. The Neil Armstrong first walk on the moon, most of you probably believe that happened. However, if you ever strike up a conversation with a moon landing denier, by the way, these people exist. They're kind of all over the place. I was on the plane one time coming back from a trip, and I sat next to a guy who didn't think we landed on the moon. It was all in studios and videotaped and this sort of thing. I'll tell you this, if you came across a moon landing denier, they would make objections and they would have arguments. They have things of why they're right, and you probably wouldn't have any answers to them. You probably would never heard that before. You probably think, well, maybe I'm wrong. But in fact, you would be 100% right. We did land on the moon in 1969, and even if you didn't have an answer, it doesn't threaten the truth of your belief. Here's the reality. You can have no answer, and you can really not even understand it very well and still be right. By the way, I don't know if you noticed that most things we believe are like this. We haven't had time to personally investigate every belief you hold. Have you personally investigated that E equals MC squared, or that Constantine won the Battle of Milvian Bridge, or that your grandparents were born in the town they said they were? How do you know that? If someone wanted to challenge you, press you, force you to really account for your beliefs, you could be someone who questioned everything. Here's another thing to note about not having all the answers, and this is really critical here. Don't make the mistake of thinking if you don't have the answer that there isn't an answer. I can't tell you how many times I've heard this. Someone thinks, well, I don't have an answer, therefore I must be wrong. Well, even if you don't have an answer, it doesn't mean there's not an answer out there, just that you don't have it. Why would you assume that you not having it means there's not one? And this is something I want you to give yourself a break with. Maybe you're 18, 19 years old. Of course you're not equipped to know every answer to every question. Why would you ever think you would be? You know, as I sat in that religion class years ago with Bart Ehrman, you know, here he is as this accomplished PhD scholar. Here I am, an 18-year-old kid. Why would I think that I could rebut everything he says? That's just not a reasonable expectation. But it doesn't mean you're wrong about what you believe. One of the things I did when I was in that situation, as I said, you know, I don't have the answer, but I bet there is an answer. And so I went looking for it. And I found out not only has these challenges been answered, they've been answered for hundreds and hundreds, if not in some cases thousands of years by the church, and answered really well. In other words, none of the things I was hearing I discovered were actually new. They are actually very old, had been said many times, had been answered many times. So you won't have all the answers, just be ready to deal with that. It doesn't mean that what you believe is necessarily false. Okay, here's a third thing for you to know as you think about surviving Religion 101. Third piece of advice or observation, here it is. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger. No, I'm not quoting Kelly Clarkson. If you don't realize it, Kelly Clarkson isn't the first one to have come up with that phrase, even though she made a very famous song out of it. The first person that we know that we think said it at least that way was actually Friedrich Nietzsche, interestingly. I don't think Kelly Clarkson knew that when she put it in her song. What does it mean to say what doesn't kill you makes you stronger? Well, I think you know what it means. It means that sometimes opposition and trials and tribulations and resistance can be a blessing. Sometimes when things are really hard, actually is beneficial to you in a way you don't expect. There's actually a very famous phrase the Navy SEALs use. Of course, you know the Navy SEALs are the sort of the elite military unit within the Navy, Special Forces, some of the best of the best. And when they come across difficulties or oppositions or trials, maybe they're trying to perform a mission and now it's raining and thunderstorming, or maybe they're trying to do something and the temperature is really bad, or maybe they've got some other thing that goes wrong. They use a phrase. The phrase they use is called full benefit. If something goes wrong, full benefit. What does that mean? That means that resistance we're experiencing is going to make us even better soldiers, even more elite fighters than we already were. So rather than looking at opposition as this great defeat where you hang your head and go, oh, okay, now I got to deal with that, or some sort of resistance as a problem you always have to overcome, the Navy SEALs look at it as an opportunity to grow, opportunity to be better, opportunity to be stronger. If you hadn't had that problem, if you hadn't had that obstacle, you wouldn't be as good a Navy SEAL as you could otherwise be. Of course, any of you who've been an athlete know that this is just factually true. I mean, just lifting weights builds you. You're pushing against resistance, right? Running suicides in your sport, okay? It builds endurance. Why? So that in game time you play better. Now, this is also true spiritually. We know this. The Bible talks about how the Christian life is like a soldier. Paul talks about how the spiritual life is like an athlete, how you train yourself to run. And it's like that in college. Here's what's going to happen. When you face intellectual resistance in college, and you will, you can either crumble and cave in, or you can full benefit it. You can say, wait a second, there's a reason God sovereignly is bringing this into my life. Why? Because he is training me, shaping me to be a more faithful Christian. Here's the reality. Most Christians that grow up in the church have, and this isn't anybody's fault, and this isn't even really that bad a thing, but it's just a reality. Most people who grow up in a Christian home, in a Christian church, have to some degree grown up in some level of a bubble, okay? When I say bubble, I just mean you haven't experienced a lot of opposition probably in your life. It's not like you have someone leaning over your shoulder every day telling you why you're wrong and what you believe. In fact, if you go to a Christian school and you go to church and you're in a Christian family, most people are probably telling you the right things to believe most of the time. Nothing wrong with that. The only problem with that, though, is that are you ready to handle it when people tell you that what you do believe is wrong? What sort of opposition are you getting to prepare for that? I'm going to talk about this in the second talk tonight, about how to fix that problem. But for now, when you get to college and face that opposition, realize that God can use it to make you a different kind of Christian. What can he do in your life because of this intellectual opposition? Well, here's one thing it'll do. It will, if you respond rightly to it, make you a better Christian thinker. It's amazing how many people leave high school, and they do love Jesus, and they are faithful followers of Christ, but they've never, ever had to articulate why they believe what they believe, and they certainly never had to defend it against anybody who's serious about opposing it. It's never had to. So you realize that your ability to think sharply about why you believe and what you believe is fairly limited. No fault of your own, really. I mean, there's something good about growing up in a Christian environment, right? But the fact of the matter is you've never had to deal with that particular problem. What's interesting is that the earliest Christians learned this lesson. In a different book that I've written, not the one in the back, it's a book called Christianity at the Crossroads, How the Second Century Shaped the Future of the Church. And this is a book on the earliest Christians we can look at outside the New Testament and learn about. One of the things that's interesting about the earliest Christians in the second century is they found themselves in significant opposition to the Greco-Roman world and attacked at every side for what they believed. Because the earliest Christian movement, you realize, grew up in a very hostile world. It makes our world look quite easy, in fact. And this hostile world was pressing them, and they said, you guys believe this, you believe this, you believe, you're loony. In fact, the philosophical elites of the day considered Christianity to be profoundly foolish. Now, here's what Christians did. In light of that intellectual opposition of their day, they were forced to think more clearly about what they believed, and they were forced to articulate it more persuasively. One of the objections that people gave to early Christians was, how could Jesus be both God and man? It's impossible. It's logically impossible. God is infinite, man is finite. You can't put those two together. That can't work. You guys are just making stuff up. So what did the Christians have to do? They had to think, well, how are we going to articulate the divinity of Jesus? How are we going to say it in a way that's coherent, makes sense? And how can we articulate it in a way that actually is defensible to a hostile world? If you do that, you're going to be a lot better thinker than just hanging around people all the time and happen to just agree with you about everything you think. And this is one of the lessons I want you to see that the early church took away, is that by the time the second century is over, and even by the time the third century is over, Christians came together and articulated a way to talk about the divinity of Christ that was coherent, clear, and decisive. You know it as the Nicene Creed, written in 325. And you probably say it in church on a periodic basis. And even if you don't do that, you probably know what it is. You could probably cite it right now. That creed has endured the test of time out of opposition, because the Greco-Roman world was hostile to the Christian faith. Here's another way that opposition is going to help you be a better Christian. It's actually going to allow you to help others. This is the other thing that you may not have thought through. You know, when we use the terms survive, Religion 101, which is the title of my book, we tend to think of that very individualistically, right? Is that I'm surviving. And certainly, you know, we always try to survive whatever we're in. But I want you to think about it. If you endure the opposition faithfully, guess what God can help you do? He can help you be the kind of Christian that helps other people survive. If you become a good thinker, you can help the next group that comes along when they're struggling. You can help your fellow Christian if they're doubting. In other words, you can become a resource for others around you to bless them, because you've done the hard work. You've dove deep into the historical and philosophical questions, and you've come out on the other side stronger than you were when you started. And that allows you to really help your fellow believer. By the way, here's another thing it'll do, is just a side note. If you do that deep intellectual work, you're actually going to also have a lot more patience and compassion with people who disagree with you. And one of the things that's unfortunate when you haven't ever dealt with opposition is that we can tend to think, well, if someone doesn't think like I do, well, they're just an idiot. You know, they're just a moron. What's wrong with you? What's your problem, right? And you're like, no, you know, intellectual inquiry is tough stuff, right? These things are complicated things. And even though God, by his grace, has shown us the truth, we can be very patient with people who are not yet there, precisely because we've dove deep into it and realized how hard these things can be. Okay, that leads us to a fourth thing I want to say tonight by way of this little list. Fourth thing I want you to take away in terms of surviving Religion 101, and this is a really critical one tonight. I don't want to pull any of these out and say they're the most important, but this certainly gets pretty close. Fourth thing is this. You need to realize that people don't believe things simply because of the facts. People don't believe things simply because of the facts. Oh, if only that were true. Wouldn't it be great if people always believed things just simply because the facts supported them? Of course, you know that's not the case deep down. It's amazing how often we tend to think that if something is true, most people will believe it. And if most people believe something, it must be true. And we actually operate with that assumption in our life without even realizing it's there. But if you just pause for a moment, that assumption is going to get you in a lot of trouble. If you think in your head that most people believe something if it's true, then what happens when you look out in the world and realize most people don't believe Christianity? Well, you have to conclude it's not true. Because if you assume that most people just follow the facts and believe something if it's true, and Christianity is only held by a minority of the people, then you're going to realize, okay, I guess I got to abandon it. This is, in my conversations with college students, this is the number one objection, aside from a particular intellectual one that they struggle with. And here's what the objection is. You get to college, you realize that hardly anyone thinks like you do. You are alone. When I say alone, of course I don't mean your fellowship group believes what you believe, and your church, okay, fine. But across the swath of a 20,000 person campus, what's the percentage of people that think you're right about Jesus rising from the dead? What's the percentage of people who think that you're correct about the Bible being the inspired word of God? Hardly any. And on top of that, here's the other fact, is that it seems like sometimes the smartest people, the most intellectually impressive people with all the degrees, are precisely the ones who don't believe. And here's what's going to happen to you if you don't have an answer to that question. There's going to be like a little sliver in your mind where you start to wonder, hold on a second. So 90% of the people think I'm wrong. My professors think I'm wrong. Every intellectual I talk to thinks I'm wrong. And yet they're all wrong, but I'm right. What's the chance of that? What's the chance of all my professors being wrong and I'm the one that's right? What's the chance of all the people I've met at college being wrong and I'm the one that's right? And that little thing will haunt you until you realize, I guess I'm not right. But what you don't realize is that hidden within that concern, it's a valid concern, is this idea that, well, if something's true, most people just believe it. But here's the reality I want you to see. Most people don't believe things because of the facts. If only that were the case. Another way to say this is that people are starting their quest for knowledge already with certain beliefs they come into that quest with. Okay, we could call this a worldview, a set of assumptions about reality. So when someone says, I'm neutral and I'm a blank slate, I'm just going to go find out what's true, that's never the case. Everyone starts that quest already with certain beliefs, certain non-negotiables already in place. People are not neutral. People are not blank slates. When someone reaches a conclusion then about what they find credible, it's actually less about the facts and more about what they started with. Think about it, for example. Someone starts with an assumption that miracles are impossible, miracles cannot happen. And then they go look at all the evidence for the resurrection and they conclude that Jesus didn't rise from the dead. You realize, is it the evidence that's leading them to this conclusion, or is it just that they're just finishing with the very place they began with, that it's impossible for miracles to happen? Therefore, it was already determined from the outset what they would believe at the end. Worldviews are very powerful things, more powerful than you realize. It's like looking at the world through colored glasses and not realizing you have colored glasses on. I don't know if you've ever worn sunglasses that not just are dark, but like you ever wore those yellow glasses? If you wore yellow glasses, it changes all the colors, and what you think is orange looks more like red, and pink looks like orange, and everything looks off. Well, if you didn't even know you had those colored glasses on, you walk through the world thinking that that's this and this is that, and you realize all the time you're looking through a lens that's coloring everything you see. That's what worldviews do. Here's the other thing we learn about the Bible, is that the non-Christian worldview already, because of the fallenness of a human heart, already is predisposed to not like the things of God, to not want to follow the things of God, to not believe the things of God. You should also know that, by the way, it's not just a spiritual reality, it's also a secular thing. Years ago, there was a very famous book written called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions by a philosopher by the name of Thomas Kuhn. I believe he was at MIT at the time. And Kuhn, in this book called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, basically says, when it comes to science, you think science works in this linear fashion where people collect a lot of data and they collect a lot of facts and they conclude with what they believe? He goes, that's not how science works. Science doesn't work that way at all. In fact, science, instead of working as this general collection of facts that ends with a conclusion, starts with a belief, starts with a theory, starts with a system, and then collects the facts in light of the system, and then the system absorbs the facts and colors the way you look at the facts. What does that mean, according to Kuhn? That means that science doesn't actually work neutrally at all. It actually has theories and systems that absorb the evidence, even if the evidence is contradictory to it. And then you might ask Kuhn, well, how does anyone ever discover anything true in science? An answer Kuhn gives is you have to have a scientific revolution. Eventually, the evidence is so overwhelming that the paradigm is shifted and flipped, and you start all over again. And of course, we could think about the shift from the geocentric to the heliocentric vision of the universe through Galileo or whatever it is, but here's the point. Even scientists aren't neutral. What does that mean when you want to know something? The only way you can really know something in the world is if you think of the world in the way God prescribes you to think of the world. In other words, you've got to think of the world through a Christian lens. That's a conversation for another day, but I cover it more in the book. For our purposes now, you just need to realize that whenever you feel like no one is with you and you're completely alone, people believe things not because of the facts, but because of the worldview they already had when they started it. And that changes things dramatically. Okay, fifth thing of our 6. Almost there in our first session. Here's the fifth thing I want to leave you with as you think about surviving Religion 101. Doubting your faith does not make you a bad Christian. Okay? Doubting your faith does not make you a bad Christian. And all these conversations about, going off to college and maybe having a crisis of faith, one of the words that keeps coming up is this word doubt. Now, I've talked a good bit about this over the years. In fact, I'll be at the TGC National Conference next week in Indianapolis speaking on doubt. I'm speaking there numerous times, but one of the things I'm speaking on is doubt. Of course, we don't have time here to fully go into doubt. I'll tell you this, there's 2 extremes out there on the doubt conversation I've seen. One extreme is really concerning, and that's what I call doubt shaming. Doubt shaming is when if someone has any questions about the faith, they're cut off, they're shut down. You're not allowed to talk about that. You're not allowed to ask those questions. You just need to believe. What's wrong with you? Maybe you're really not a Christian. And some Christian cultures operate this way. Some of you may have grown up in a Christian culture that was a doubt-shaming culture where you just weren't allowed to go there. If you had any tough questions for the faith, well, just deal. Just keep it to yourself. We don't handle that kind of stuff around here. Just believe. Well, what happens with people if they grow up in an environment like that? Well, they don't ever get their questions answered because they're not allowed to ask them. So if someone grows up in an environment that's a doubt-shaming environment, guess what happens? Of course they're going to go off to college and finally learn things and finally start having conversations and then maybe, hopefully not, but perhaps really start moving in a different direction away from the faith because they never had their doubts allowed. But here's another extreme, too, in our world about doubt, and that is what I call doubt celebrators. It's the opposite extreme. There was a book that came out not long ago from a Christian press, and the name of the book was The Sin of Certainty. The sin of certainty. The idea that if you're all too certain about what you believe, well, then that's the problem with you. You Christians are far too certain about what you believe. Shame on you. And so you got this sort of doubt celebrators, as if the greatest virtue in the Christian life is doubting. Okay, well, that's not good either. Neither extreme is good. What I want you to realize, though, is that the Bible has a lot to say about doubt. We can't say it all here. But Christ is very compassionate to those who doubt. Not only is doubt common, it's widespread, it's in a sense normal, and Christ is very patient with doubters. In fact, time and time again, rather than scolding doubters, Jesus helps them and doesn't, attack them. In fact, one of the most famous verses in this regard is from the book of Jude. When's the last time you read the book of Jude, right? Jude 22. Have mercy on those who doubt. Jesus is compassionate with Thomas when he doubts. Jesus is compassionate with us when we doubt. Do we need to fight our doubts? Of course we do. Of course we need to fight our doubts. But one of the ways you're going to get through the college experience is not realizing as soon as you have a doubt that you suddenly crumble to the ground thinking, I guess I'm a bad Christian or maybe not a Christian at all. No, it's actually a pretty normal part of the Christian life. One of the most common places that people doubt isn't even really in college, even though that happens a lot. One of the most common times people doubt is in times in their life of very serious suffering. You don't have to be in college to see very serious suffering. You can see very, very serious suffering at the age of 30 or 40 or 50 or 60. You lose a loved one, you lose a child, someone dies from cancer, there's a car wreck, there's a natural disaster. Guess what? That's almost the number one cause of doubt. So if you think doubt is like a college problem, no, it's a life problem. It's time to learn how to deal with it, okay? And the first thing I want you to realize here, it doesn't make you a bad Christian. It doesn't even make you not a Christian. It's actually a very common part of the Christian life. You need to work to fight it, but Jesus is compassionate and patient as we struggle with our doubts. Okay, here's the last thing. Sixth and final thing I'll say here as you think about how to survive Religion 101. And this is my sort of final piece of advice in this first talk. And that is stick together as a band of brothers or sisters. Stick together as a band of brothers or sisters. Okay, so one of the things I enjoy, this is sort of like, Dr. Kruger confession time. So I like scary movies. I'm just going to put that out there. And my wife thinks I'm weird, and so do you probably. And now that I've said that, I probably won't be preaching tomorrow, but who knows? So I like scary movies. They're fun, and there's some things about it that are intriguing on a worldview level I won't get into. But I'll tell you this about scary movies, whether you like them or not. The protagonist in scary movies always makes the same mistake. They pick up on these in commercials, right? What does the person always do when there's a scary moment in a movie? They always go off alone and in the dark, right? And you're like, what is wrong with you people, right? Is it like just common sense leaves? Like, it's a scary moment, you're in a haunted house, you're going to go off, oh, this is a good idea, you're going to go off alone. And of course, there's no lights and it's in the dark. I mean, this is crazy. If you want to get through the scary movie, you stay in a group and you stay in the light, right? That's how you survive these things. Well, I'm going to give you my horror movie advice, okay, for those of you who are going off to college. My horror movie advice is stay in the group, stay in the light. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is the place where doubts germinate and the soil in which they grow is solitariness, right? Aloneness. If you're going to fight your doubts, work through your issues, deal with intellectual challenges, you can't do it alone. Don't make the mistake of the scary movie person where you go off by yourself in the dark. It's not going to turn out well spiritually, okay? Spiritually, you stay in fellowship and you stay in the place where the spiritual light is. What does that mean for this last piece of advice? That means when you go off to college, and for those of you already in college, you've got to find good fellowship. That's the number one cause of people losing their way, is they went off alone in the dark and they didn't deal with these things in community. Now, the fact that you're here tonight probably is a good sign you're on the right track. I mean, anytime those of us in ministry who give a message, usually the people who need to hear it the most are actually not there to hear the message. Okay, so fair enough. So you're here tonight, so you're already at least at some level or in some fellowship group. Okay, great. But there's also ways to get plugged in at deeper levels, to get involved, to be active, to really build relationships with your fellow Christians. This can include a campus fellowship, RUF crew, something like that. It can include a local church like this one. This is going to be sort of the number one key to your survival, right? Is don't go off into the dark alone. And this is, of course, true in life generally, right? It's that band of brothers or sisters that keeps people together in war. Okay, think about wartime. How do people survive in wartime? How do they press through all the craziness, all the awfulness? Well, they were with their friends when they were fighting, right? They weren't fighting alone. They're fighting with their friends. There's a sense in which they're fighting for their friends, right? And in the Christian context, you're fighting for your fellow believers. You're fighting with your fellow believers, all for the cause of the battle you're in. So you've got to find fellowship, rich, good fellowship, and stick with it and invest in it. Every time I talk to a believer who had a good college experience, that's the number one reason why. Now, as I draw this first talk to a close, I mentioned my own story, which is, years ago I went off to UNC and had Bart Ehrman as a professor, and that was my journey of doubt that the Lord brought me through. What's interesting is that when I wrote this book, the reason I finally wrote it, I'd been thinking about writing it for years. And my wife, who's been poking at me for years, in a good way, said, you need to write this book, you need to write this book. I'm like, yeah, I got a lot of books to write. You need to write this book. Finally, the reason that I wrote the book is because my oldest child, Emma, was accepted to UNC Chapel Hill. And almost 30 years to the day later, she starts at UNC. And I thought, okay, it's time. So I wrote the book. And so I wrote the book in the form of letters to my daughter. That's the format of the book. Each chapter is a letter to her. Now, of course, it's a letter to everybody who reads it, right? Of course. But she's a real person. Some people read the book and go, who's Emma? And I'm like, my daughter, right? If you read the introduction, you know this. They think it's like a fake person. I'm just making things up. No, she's a real person. I actually wrote these letters to her, and they're now in the book. But she went off to college, and she actually was signed up for a class with Bart Ehrman. And then COVID hit. And she never had the class. So we'll never know what it would have been like for her to actually have the class with him, but she had other religion classes. She had many other challenging times in colleges intellectually, but she came out really strong spiritually. And one of the key reasons is because she got in good fellowship and walked with other believers during that time. Now she just graduated and she's off into the real world, which has its own challenges, but I'm thankful to have seen her through it. But I've got 2 more now that have to get through college, and so that's part of what's behind the book. But that's my final piece of advice to you in this first session, and one that I hope is helpful to you. Okay, I'm going to wrap us up here, our first session, then we're going to take a short, like 10-minute, like go to the bathroom and come back thing, and then we will have session 2. Where's my guys? Is that right? 7 o'clock. We're starting back at 7 o'clock. It's 6:51, so you have 9 minutes. Make it a good 9 minutes. I'm going to pray for us, and then we'll wrap up session number 1. Let's pray. Lord, thank you for your goodness and for a chance to be together, and we thank you for the way you preserve your people, even in tough times. Bless these college students and others around that age as they think about this tonight. We pray in Christ's name. Amen. See you at 7 o'clock. Oh yeah, all these things are true for life and children. Right. Okay, I've been told to be the MC gatherer guy here, so I'm going to be that guy. We'll go ahead and get started here with session number 2. Thanks for not running off to some other football game. Appreciate that. I always tell people at church conferences when it comes to the session number 2 that there's always a Christian remnant, and you are it tonight, so good job. All right, we are moving from the discussion of how to survive Religion 101 as a college student, which is what I focused my first talk on. And by the way, just as a sidebar, I trust that those of you who are here who are not college students, and maybe not even parents of college students, realize that actually all the 6 things I said in talk 1 apply to all Christians, do they not? And so there's nothing in this that's inherently unique to college students and only for them. And actually, one of the things that I've learned about my book and a lot of the conversations I've had and podcasts I've done for it is some of the most enthusiastic people for my book are actually parents who read the book. And like, I've learned so much reading the book with my college kid. So I think you'll realize it's for everybody. And I really hope that both adults and students can both benefit from it. But in the second session tonight, though, I want to transition slightly to a topic that's tweaked. It's not so much surviving Religion 101, but preparing for Religion 101. Here's one of the things that's interesting about the book is that after I wrote it, I realized that almost everybody I was talking to actually didn't want to talk about the book. That's kind of odd, isn't it? Now, let me explain what I mean by that. I write the book about surviving Religion 101, and everyone says, but how do I make sure my kid doesn't have to survive Religion 101? Or to put it another way, I don't want to wait till my child's 19 to do something, okay? And I'm like, wow, that's a pretty good point. Now, I wrote the book for people in college or about to go, and you could argue that maybe, there's so much that could have been done before that. And so I'm writing a book almost for a lot of students who are struggling. You could argue that maybe your struggle will be different if some other things have been done before this. Okay, fair point. But I didn't write the book for the earlier stages. I wrote the book for the people who are in the middle of it as they're enduring it or about to go. But in the second talk, though, I do want to probe into this other question. What do you do to prepare? Now, who does this apply to? Well, certainly it can apply to anybody who's listening, because I think that the advice I have here I think is still helpful, I trust. But it's certainly going to apply to you if you're younger. So maybe you're a student here and you're not 18 about to go to college, or 17. Maybe you're 12, or maybe you're 13 and you've got some time. Okay, fair enough. It also could apply to parents who are here who have young kids and are thinking about how to prepare them for college. But it could also apply just to the church as a whole, because part of this is learning how to think about building a community to prepare people to go out into the real world. Okay. So this second talk, then, I want to lay out some features I think that provide healthy preparation for people who are headed off or will in a little while be heading off to college. Now, I know as I do this, I'm really tapping into one of the deepest fears as parents, right? Parents have all kinds of fears, and I could list them tonight, but that's not my goal. But I think one fear is, what if I raise a child as faithfully as I can as a believer, I send them to these schools, Christian schools, etc., and we pray for them, and then they go up and they're not believers? What if that happens? You don't need me to tell you that happens sometimes. I've got good friends. I've got one colleague at the seminary who has 3 grown, he's just a wonderfully godly man and his godly wife, and they raised their 3 boys, and none of them are Christians. It's very heartbreaking. And you realize that this is not unusual. The Bible talks about this a lot. I'll just read one passage, 1 Samuel 8. Samuel, of course, is sort of the leader of Israel spiritually at the time, right? He's, in one sense, both sort of priest and prophet in the temple. And you think, okay, here's a godly man who was given by his mother when he was a boy and grew up, and he's the guy, who's done so many wonderful things. But here's what we read in 1 Samuel 8. When Samuel became old, he made his sons judges over Israel. Yet, his sons did not walk in his ways and turned aside after gain. They took bribes and perverted justice. Now, that's just one story of many stories I could read in the Bible where you have a seemingly godly parent and then kids that don't follow. Now, I think it goes without saying that whatever I say in this short second talk tonight is not going to be the ultimate solution to any of that. But I do think we can give more thought to what we do before they go rather than trying to solve a crisis after they go, which is the whole point of this second talk. Not to throw fuel on the fire here, but I did read a recent Barna study. And Barna studies should be taken with a grain of salt, right? Because I don't think Barna does these studies about what Christians think and what Christians do. And I'm like, I don't even know if half these people are really even Christians. So, okay, we'll leave that aside. But the Barna studies, I think, are still illuminating in a number of ways. Recent Barna study said that he estimated as much as 70% of students walk away from faith sometime during their college years. I don't know if that's accurate or not. I think I could say, though, if it's even half that, that would make me a little nervous. And I know all of us want to do the best job we can as families, parents, and Christian community for making people ready for the next stage of life. Here's what I've discovered, though, over the course of writing this book and just being in Christian spaces for a long time, is that I'm sort of surprised at how we haven't thought more about this. And I'm not saying that you haven't thought. Maybe this congregation is the exception to the rule. Fair enough. But I grew up in a Christian home. My parents loved Jesus, took me to church every week, but I was not ready. I'll tell you one way I was ready, broadly, is I think most preparation for students going off to college is what I call moral preparation. If you go off to college, don't sleep around, don't get into the party scene, don't act like a buffoon, don't do drugs, be a good person. And by the way, are those bad things? No. I mean, when your kid goes off, do you want him in the party scene? Probably not. Do you want him doing drugs? No. Right? You want him sleeping around? No. Are those biblical principles? Yes. But I think we also know at the same time that if that's the extent of our preparation for children going off to college, we missed something. It doesn't take much insight to realize that if you don't give people an intellectual and theological and worldview foundation for why they're doing those things or not doing those things, then as soon as they get a chance to go a different direction, they will. So there has to be intellectual preparation. And that's the thing I didn't have when I grew up. And I'm not dinging my parents. They love Jesus and I love them. They're the greatest. But I didn't have a single thought about how to interact with a non-Christian on an intellectual level before I went to college. How did that get missed? That was a part of my youth group. Is that not something that I should have been taught? Probably. Was I taught that? No. So what I'm going to lay out here is just food for thought. Okay? I'm going to give you 4 things to chew on here that I think are important for families, but I can also speak a little bit to the pastors and elders, some of you are here, that this is also true for a church, okay? Because church is a family, is it not? So just like a literal family is a family with fathers and mothers and children and brothers and sisters, so God's community is a family with fathers and mothers and brothers and sisters and sons and daughters. So in some sense, what I'm saying here is much about Trinity Pres as it is about your personal home. Okay, 4 things to chew on, and then I'm going to open it up for Q&A. Okay, number 1, if you're going to prepare the next generation, you have to think about intentional preparation instead of just hoping. Intentional preparation instead of just hoping. Let me explain what I mean by this. If I were to talk about how to sort of lead a Christian family and prepare your kids for the next generation, there would be some non-negotiable basics, right? And these are non-negotiable basics I'm not even going to talk about tonight, but they would include things like family devotions, praying with your kids, taking them to church, including them in the Christian community, on and on it goes. Obviously, any family has to do these things at a bare minimum as a basis for caring for your kids on a Christian level. So I'm not diminishing those. Those are essential. Those are the foundation starting points. But here's the danger. For most families, and I would say for churches, we assume that if I'm just doing the basics, these 3 fundamental things or 4 fundamental things, that all is going to work out when they leave. Or at least I hope it does. And there's not really any intentional preparation for when they leave. It's just a generic preparation for them leaving. This is a little bit of what I call the autopilot mode of ministry or mode of family. Autopilot mode of ministry is sort of a generic, categorical, it's like the hats that fit everybody. You put it on, it's like this one size fits all. It's like every part of ministry is like that. So I'm not really thinking about particular things I'm trying to solve. I'm not really thinking about particular challenges I'm trying to meet. I'm just going to give you sort of the basic stuff. And by the way, this is not a minimization of the basic stuff. If you're talking about just preaching the Bible every week and praying every week, those are so critical. But if we're going to prepare the next generation for life after being in a Christian family, we've got to think about the particulars too. Particular preparation, intentional preparation for the things they're going to face. Now, as I'll say in a moment, I think what that means is that there needs to be a plan in place for how we're doing that. My goal tonight is not to give you your family plan. And it's not even to give you the church plan. Okay, that's for your family to figure out, the church to figure out. But here is my point tonight. Have a plan. Most people just don't have a plan. If I say, how are you preparing your kids for life in college at a secular university? The answer is, well, we take them to church. Is that a bad thing? It's a great thing. Is that going to really be important? It's incredibly important. Is that all that can be done or should be done? I would suggest to you that a plan includes many more things than that based on the world we find ourselves in. Why? Because the average situation of a student when they're going through a normal curriculum in a normal youth group isn't to get the things that sometimes they need when they get out of college. I didn't get any of them, and I don't want to presume anything here, but I know that many people feel like that happened to them when they got to college. So if you're thinking about your family life right now and you don't have a plan for how to prepare your kids for the next stage, then you need to think about what am I having them read? What do I want to topics do I want to work through with them? How are we going to have discussions about these things? What am I going to expose them to? I'm going to come back to that in a moment. Now, on the flip side, before I leave this first point, I want to also offer a caution. Whenever I talk to parents about having family plans for their kids or churches having plans for their sort of spiritual kids as they go out, there's always another thing that needs to be said, and that is sometimes we think that our acts of preparation somehow decide our children's fate. And I want to be very, very clear about this. Two things we want to affirm, and they seem paradoxical in a sense they are. Here's the two things we want to affirm. First, what you do as a parent really matters. God cares about it. It makes an impact. It matters to God and matters to your kids. So don't think that what you do as a parent is irrelevant, because it's not irrelevant. The Bible says all kinds of things about being a good parent, preparing your children. On the flip side, you also want to affirm something else paradoxical. All your good work as a parent will not save your children. All your good work as a parent is not a guarantee that they will be saved or stay faithful spiritually. So you don't get to decide or determine your child's fate. That's in God's hands. But at the same time, it doesn't mean what we do doesn't matter. I think we all know plenty of godly parents. I just told you a story of one that raised their kids faithfully, spiritually, pray for them, teach them the Bible, everything you would ever check off on any box, and they walk away from the faith. But I could also give you the opposite story. Some parents that maybe didn't do such a great job. Maybe you think you're one of them, right? Sometimes I wake up and go, man, I could have done a lot more. And you're like, some parents were lousy parents, right? They didn't really take their kids to church very well. They didn't really take interest in their kids' spiritual life, and their kids, by God's grace, are faithfully walking with Him. Does that mean parenting doesn't matter? Of course it doesn't. But it does help you remember that no matter what preparation plan you have in place, it's all still in God's hands for our kids. And that's why we believe in the sovereignty of God, isn't it? Because we believe that God's a good God, and we can go to Him in prayer and ask that He would bless and keep our kids. So the first thing is to not just go on autopilot, in whatever place you're in. Here's the second thing, as we think about preparing kids for the next generation. It's what I call wise exposure instead of just isolation. Wise exposure instead of just isolation. I came across a fascinating book recently. It was published in 2017 by a professor at the University of Chicago called Jack Gilbert. He's a microbiologist. And I gotta say, this is one of the best titles of a book I've heard in a long time. You can tell, some books are bestsellers because the title's great, okay? I don't know if this book is a bestseller, but from what I understand, it actually is a really good seller. Here's the title of the book by Jack Gilbert. Dirt is Good is the main title. Dirt is Good. Subtitle, The Advantage of Germs for Your Child's Developing Immune System. Now, I bet just by the title you can predict where he's going with this book, because I think it's common sense where things now are turning scientifically when it comes to germs. You've probably met parents out there, and maybe you are one of them, that's sort of the hypergerm parent. You ever met one of those? Hypergerm parent has bottles of sanitizer in every room of the house, right? When the kid goes out, you got to wash your hands 11 times a day. Make sure that you don't get across anyone who's sick. Can't play in the dirt. Can't play in the woods. Got to make sure that you're always taking your vitamins. Got Clorox wipes in case you need to wipe down any counters or things on the plane or in the car or in the gas station or whatever it happens to be. You go to a restaurant, you wipe down the silverware. Okay, there's people who are like that. And sometimes they're pretty successful at it. In fact, scientific studies have shown that actually a lot of kids can go through many years of their life and really not get sick because their parents have done such a good job protecting them from getting sick. You can even imagine a parent saying, little Johnny is 17 and little Johnny's never really gotten seriously sick his whole life. I feel so successful as a parent. I feel like I've really done my duty. I've really protected little Johnny. But then you know what happens, right? At age 18, little Johnny catches a cold. And then that cold turns into an infection, and that infection turns into sepsis, and little Johnny dies. And everyone's like, well, how do you die from a cold? And the answer is, according to the book here, is because if you don't get exposure to germs when you're young, your immune system never gets kick-started. If you're not exposed to germs when you're little, your immune system never gears up to fight the real germs that matter. Here's the ironic thing then that Gilbert points out in the book, is that when you think you're protecting your child, you might actually be hurting them. When you think you're protecting them from all the bad things that can happen to them, actually you might actually be setting them up for the bad things that can happen to them. Now, I know what's going on in your head right now. Some of you are like, oh, I guess some of you are feeling kind of guilty. I'm taking my hand sanitizer and all this stuff out. No, I don't care about any of that. I'm not bringing up the book title because I have an opinion about it. Maybe he's wrong, maybe he's right. He does bring up that all the allergies and all the food allergies and things that happen probably are related to this too. But I'm not care about the science. I want to use the spiritual analogy. You can see where I'm going with this. Whether you pick up a pacifier or not when it falls to the ground. Ever done that? Parents, pacifier falls to the ground, you stare at it for a second. 5-second rule apply to pacifiers? I don't know. Maybe it does. If I stick it back in my child and they get sick, I'll feel really bad, but I don't want to walk all the way to the bathroom to wash the pacifier, and so we go around and around and around. Here's the point. Spiritually speaking, we need to take a lead from Jack Gilbert's book. As nervous Christian parents, we can raise our children in a spiritual bubble, like the kid in the hospital who never gets access to any germs, and we think, all done here, I've done my job. Maybe not. Because then that child goes off to college and they get creamed because they never got exposed to anything that looks like an unbelieving thought in their whole life. And when they hear one from someone, their spiritual immune system never got boosted. They were never ready. They can always say to themselves, I've never heard that before. My parents never told me that before. It's actually one of the things I told my children. I said, one of my goals with you is to try to reduce the number of times you get to college and say, my dad never told me that before. What I'd love to happen at college is for you to hear an unbelieving idea and you say, yeah, I've heard it a bunch of times, I know the answer, been down this path. So here's my suggestion for you as parents and as a church, for the elders and pastors, we need to wisely and appropriately expose our people, our children, to unbelieving thoughts, to help them know how to overcome them and fight against them. Now notice that I use the term wisely and appropriately. I don't take a 12-year-old and dump every critical argument of Bart Ehrman on them. Okay, they're not ready for that. That's not helping them. Okay? And by the way, if you talk to Jack Gilbert who wrote this book, he's like, there are real pathogens that can kill your kids. He's not denying that. He's saying appropriately some exposure to some germs is helpful. Same thing here. We need to think differently about how we protect them, and rather we need to think about exposing them appropriately and wisely to unbelieving thoughts so that they are inoculated spiritually against it. What does that look like? That looks like finding ways to talk to your kids about arguments against what they believe. And then you're like, that's weird. At the dinner table, I'm trying to tell them why they should believe, yeah? But one of the ways you persuade them why you believe is sometimes you do some of the things why other people don't believe and why those things don't hold up upon further scrutiny. Now, I know what some parents will say, but I don't know how to do that. I don't know how to train my kid against non-Christian thought because I don't know how to fight non-Christian thought. Well, then there's an opportunity for you to learn too, right? Here's the thing I want you to realize. It's generational. If a parent doesn't know how to fight non-Christian thought, they can't teach their kids how to do it because they don't know how to do it, and their kids don't know how to do it, and on it goes. At some point, the cycle has to be broken. Now, I know what some of you will say. Well, I don't have to worry about any of this because I'm just going to send my kid to a Christian school, Christian college. And if I send my kid to a Christian college, no problems. I don't have to worry about any of this preparation stuff. I'll just send them to a Christian college, and then they'll go from Christian family to Christian church to Christian high school to Christian college, and it's going to work out great because it's all Christian. But of course, I think you know that doesn't work. It doesn't work for lots of reasons. One is a lot of Christian colleges are not that Christian anymore. Okay, there's one reason. Secondly, even at Christian colleges, people are exposed to all kinds of people with different views. And then thirdly, what do you do when your kid gets graduated from college? At 22, do they go to a Christian workplace and live in a Christian neighborhood? And you can't avoid the world forever. Besides, how do you avoid the world forever when we're called to go to the world and bring the gospel to them? So what you're preparing your kid to do when they're 11 is something they're going to eventually have to do. There's no way around it. If we're faithfully following Christ, there's no way around it. We could go buy property in the middle of, the desert and build a commune and be all David Koresh and everything. Okay, you could do that. That's called a cult. That doesn't ever turn out well. If you're going to live in the real world and be salt and light, you've got to eventually deal with that. So here's some practical questions under this second point. Has your child ever read a book that argues against Christianity? Has he ever watched a video clip of anyone arguing against Christianity? Does he ever have any non-Christian friends? Is your child aware of the kind of arguments that could be coming their way? Has your child ever been asked to explain why they believe what they believe? It's one thing to say, here's what I believe. Most people can do that because this is regurgitate the creed, right? Here's what I believe. I don't want to ask what you believe. I want to know why you believe it. It's a different question. By the way, can you answer that question as an adult? Why do you believe in Christianity? Why do you believe God exists? Why do you believe Jesus really did the things he said? Do you have an answer? And you realize if I don't even have an answer, then I need to do the work too to make sure I can train my child. Okay, third suggestion here as we think about preparing the next generation, both as individual families and as church family. It's what I call purposeful dialogue instead of just instruction. Purposeful dialogue instead of just instruction. Now, I know how most learning works in life, and you know it too because you've been through elementary school and high school and college, most of you. Some of you have been to master's programs. I teach at a seminary. We do master's and doctoral programs. I spend all my time almost teaching people one-directionally. I stand in front of a room like I'm doing tonight, and I lecture, and I tell you things. And I tell you how to think about things, and then I talk, and you listen, okay? I got one of my students over here, Nathan at Karma, right? He's probably like, oh, I've heard well enough of Dr. Kruger. I don't hear any more, right? And by the way, there's a place for that. It's totally appropriate to have one-directional teaching. Tomorrow morning in the sermon, it's appropriately and divinely given that it's one-directional, and that's fine. But there's also limits to that. We do know that just in terms of pedagogical effectiveness, people learn a lot better when they don't just get talked at, but they're asked to interact with the ideas that are being thrown at them. They have to restate the material, articulate the material. Sometimes they even are asked to defend the material. This is, by the way, one of the things that the Brits have all over us when it comes to education. In the British model of education, there are these, especially at the doctoral level, but even at the undergraduate level, there's what they call seminars, and they're not classes. The seminars are dialogical, and they're designed to bring in and interact with the professor and with your fellow students over ideas, and it creates an entirely different learning environment. And what you realize is that there's different levels of learning. There's data acceptance, right, where you can sort of get data in your head. Then there's the regurgitation of that data, right, on a sheet of paper. And there's an articulation of why you believe the truth of that information. But then there's another step, and that is defending it against someone who's intent on breaking it down. You can believe something, know it, and even articulate it and still not be able to defend it. And I would imagine most people don't even know how to get past the first step. Yes, I believe it, but I have no idea how to restate it, articulate it, or defend it. Now, I'm not suggesting that by the time little Sally graduates from high school, she's all near having a PhD or something like that. But these are very basic things if you think about it, because it just doesn't require all that much. It actually requires conversation. So here's an idea for you. At a church level and a family level, rethink the way you engage with your children's, at a church level or a family level, rather than just give them lessons or devotions or talks or messages only one directional. What would it look like to sit down and actually discuss an idea? What do you think about this idea? Let's watch this 30-second clip. What do you think about that? What impression is that making? How would you respond to that? What does that guy get right? What does that guy get wrong? I used to, when my kids were young, at the dinner table, I would pretend to be an atheist at the dinner table. And so I would tell my kids, "You believe in God?" And they're like, "Yeah." I was like, "That's crazy." I was like, "How do you explain all the evil in the world?" And they would look at me like, "I don't know." And I'm like, "Well, come on." And I would nudge them and prompt them, and I would actually, we'd go on road trips, and I would be, skeptic in the front seat, and they would have to interact with me and figure out, well, why am I wrong and why are you right? I would give them all these pushbacks. One time in a church I was at, we had a youth group event. This is an idea for your staff, where I came in and talked to the youth group, where I had two halves of my talk. The first 30 minutes, I was an unbelieving professor who explained all the reasons why you shouldn't believe the Bible. And in the second half of the talk, I was the believing professor who undid all the things I said in the first half of the talk. So I came into this group of about 100 youth in my church and said, "All right." And I just took on, almost like an actor, I took on the mode of non-Christian professor at a university. And just for 30 minutes, just absolutely tore apart everything they believed. And by the time I was over, their eyes were about this big. They're like, "What in the world?" My daughter, who was actually in the youth group at the time, said to me later, "Dad, you make a really good unbeliever." I'm not sure if that's a good thing or not. But then in the second half, I said, well, here's all the reasons why I don't actually believe what I said in the first half. And you could tell that the level of attention was so different than me just simply going, okay, let's just say here's all the things we believe. What about the things we don't believe? And why don't we believe them? And why do we believe the things we do? Those are just some ideas that have worked in the past. And I think that is some food for thought. Okay, fourth and finally here, in the prepping your kids for the next stage of life. And we've mentioned several here, right? Intentional preparation instead of just hoping, wise exposure instead of just isolation, purposeful dialogue instead of just instruction, and now fourth and finally, allowing doubts instead of just giving answers. Allowing doubts instead of just giving answers. I'll return in this last point to one of the points in my prior talk briefly, and that is the role of doubts in allowing a place for them to be expressed. I mentioned, the two extremes out there when it comes to doubt. The doubt shaming, which is shame on you for having a doubt, and then the doubt celebrating, and we want to be neither of those. I want to suggest to you that churches tend to be most in danger of the first, okay, the doubt shaming. And then others in the secular space tend to be more in danger of the second, which is the doubt celebrators. The greatest virtue ever is if you doubt everything you believe, kind of thing. What are you doing in your church or in your family when a child has doubts? What do you do with them? This is going to be hugely important for the way you prepare them to go out the door. And I've talked to many parents who just didn't know what to do when their child says, I don't know if I believe that. What do you do? Well, you could drop the hammer, say, well, yeah, you do. We raised you right, blah, 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 blah. Of course you do. Stop talking that way. Then on the other side, some parents just ignore it. Say, they'll get over it. Everybody, they're teenagers. They'll say anything. Don't have to worry about it. No, there's a point where you have to address their doubts. And here's the thing. Rather than just solving them with an answer, allow them to be expressed. That doesn't mean we don't give an answer. Of course you give an answer to a question that's asked of you. But you don't give an answer in a perfunctory way where you never allow the person to really express their concern over the issue they're facing. I see this all the time in churches. Someone goes, well, I hear what you're saying, but I'm really struggling with this over here. And you're like, oh, that's fine. That's fine because of this, this, and this. And I've answered your question. Well, maybe. But intellectual things are complicated, and belief is complicated. And sometimes people struggle to believe certain things. Sometimes you may not struggle with it, but other people might. Even if you don't struggle with it, what if your child struggles with it? Sometimes we think that, well, if I can believe it, you should believe it. If I don't have any trouble with it, if I don't have any objection, you shouldn't have any objection. So, I mean, this can look a lot of different ways. It could be something about miracles. It could be something about, like, evolution. Like someone says, well, evolution's not true, and you just believe the Bible, Genesis account. Okay, and it's like, well, I heard this thing in class about this, and that sounds pretty compelling to me. What do we do with that? You're like, oh, don't worry about it. We got answers for that. No, that is not the kind of environment that's going to create healthy belief. We've got to give space for doubts. Let me ask it on a church level. This is a weird way to do it, but like on a church level, is there any space that I would call safe space in a church where someone could come and say, you know what, I don't know if I agree with that. I don't know if that's true. I know that sounds awkward because, in a church, you're like, well, we think this is true, and here's what we're saying. You're like, well, you shouldn't sort of push back on that, but not during a sermon, of course. We're not saying someone should raise their hand in a sermon. No, I don't believe that, right? Sermons are intentionally, one-directional, and that's biblical and right. But what about after a sermon? What if you had like a discussion area where you could say, hey, come tell me what you thought about the sermon. Is it great, bad, rubbish, wonderful? What? You disagree, agree? And people didn't feel like that if they did that, they were just chastened and quasi-shunned, and like some Christian communities do occasionally, but we're going to welcome that. I want to suggest a couple things to you. If you did that, here's what would happen. One is you would end up producing stronger believers who feel like they have the space to wrestle with those things and come out stronger on the other end. But there's also be a place where non-Christians could come. They could come and not feel threatened because they could see there's an openness to those conversations. Now, here's the biggest obstacle to that is our own sense of being able to handle that, okay? We feel obligated to sort of squash any disagreement as soon as it gets its little head up out of the water, right? It's like the whack-a-mole. Oh, disagreement, smack. Oh, disagreement, smack. And there's a right sense in which that comes from a love of the truth. All that's good. But I want you to notice that in the history of Christianity, that when people have had doubts and struggles, that there's space to express those. I don't have it in front of me, but in my talk next week at TGC, I'll mention this. There was a quote from C.H. Spurgeon about his own doubts. I don't know if you realize that some of the most famous Christians that you and I treasure and rah-rah, superhero Christian struggle with doubts immensely. Yeah, you probably know Martin Luther was tremendously haunted by all his doubts and worries and anxieties. So much so that Luther had all kinds of issues around this, where he would scream, at what he thought was the devil in his room, and he would do all kinds of other things. He really struggled with all kinds of doubts and insecurities. But Spurgeon did too. Spurgeon, and like I said, I don't have the quote here. I wish I had brought it. Basically said, I woke up one day and I wondered if everything I believed was a lie. And I couldn't get it out of my head. And I kept rolling it around in my head, and I kept rolling, and this actually was a struggle with him for quite a while. And eventually the Lord helped him overcome it, and he moved on. But Spurgeon? Really? Spurgeon's going to have a doubt? Well, then I think we all know there's space for doing that. So we don't want to leave doubt unchecked because it can do real spiritual damage, but how do you know to check it if you don't know it's there? And the only way you know it's there is if you let people express it, and then you gently, patiently, kindly help them walk through it. All right, so those are the 4 things I want to leave with you as you think about preparation. And the big takeaway here, I think you can see, is that these things create, if I could use this term, they create a culture around how to think Christianly. They create a culture about how to intellectually engage with the world. And that, you can have very healthy church cultures that allow for that. You can have very unhealthy church cultures that allow for that. So, my encouragement to you is both a family and your little family culture and a church culture that you think, how can we be a spot where we're going to really make sure that when someone leaves here and they go off to college or go to the next thing, that they don't ever really say, my pastor never told me about that. No, they can say, I heard it, we talked about it, and we dealt with it. Now, if you want to talk about some doubts tomorrow in Sunday school, I'm going to give you a whole bunch of them. And I'm going to then refute them all, I hope. We're going to talk about big misconceptions about how the canon was formed. That's going to be our Sunday school class at 9:30. Right now, though, I want to transition us to our Q&A time. And this is your chance to express your doubts about me. No, I'm just kidding. This is your chance. You can disagree. Actually, you really can. But this is your chance to ask a question, make a comment, reflect on anything I've said tonight or any other issue related to the truth of what we believe. I think the gate's wide open here if that's right. So if you have a question, just raise your hand and try to speak up so we can hear you, and we'll move on from there. Yep, starting right here.
Do you have a recommendation for a book that would be great for dinner-time conversations, or will you write a book on dinner-time?
Yes. That's interesting.
What was the question?
Yeah, thank you. The question was, what book would you recommend for dinner time conversations? And would you write one? If I haven't. Well, not to sort of state the obvious, I do think the questions I raise in my book, Surviving Religion 1, are actually really good conversation topics, because it has to do with existence of God, problem of evil, why the Bible is true. I don't know of anything that's sort of short and to the point, but you could go through some of these apologetic books that I think ask questions. So, for example, R.C. Sproul has a book called That's a Good Question. And each of them is just like a half a page of the question and the answer. What if you went through those questions with your kids? And you actually, here's a tip for you, by the way, if you do this. Let them mull over the question before you give the answer. Right? So if the question is, why does a good God still allow evil? Well, Sproul answers it. That's why I wrote the book. But don't just read the answer. That goes back to my prior point. Ask your kids, well, what would you say? Now you're going to get some really curious answers, right? Depending on the age of your kids see crazy things, right? So you're going to have a lot of entertainment at the dinner table around these sorts of things. Great question. Other questions? This is your chance. Come on, stump the professor. Yes? Yeah, it's an interesting question. So basically, to rephrase the question, because there's not a microphone, it was something along the lines of, well, what maybe prior generations had to deal when they were older and out of the house, current generations are seeming to have to do while they're still at home. And I think there's a lot of truth in that. My little phrase to parents now is that high school's the new college. So when I think about the kind of stuff I dealt with in college, I think most people are dealing with that in high school now. And I don't think it's only social media related, though. I think it is connected to that because you can get access to things like never before, and that's often not good. But it's not just about social media. It's about the cultural press down where they keep wanting to address these issues younger. And so, if I was in college at UNC, which is pretty liberal, you'd have people protesting this and making claims about that and little groups forming around different identity categories. Never really happened in high school. But now in high school, that's exactly what's happening. It's just trickled down. So yeah, if you feel behind, I'm not trying to scare anybody, if you feel behind, you're probably maybe leaving a little more behind than you realize, right? Because it's actually getting to things more quickly. Now, I know in your mind, you're like, but my kid goes to a Christian school, which is great. Christian schools are great. But it's an inevitability, right? It's eventually going to have to be dealt with. Yep.
Dr. Kruger, what would you say to a college student who's sitting through a lecture and his professor is railing against Christ or railing against the Bible, or in a biology class and they're putting forward just a terribly unbiblical perspective, and they're caught between obviously wanting to respect the person that's got authority over them in that situation, but also wanting to not shy away from being bold for Christ on the campus? What does it look like to be bold for Christ, innocent as a dove, shrewd as the serpent,
Yeah.
in that context?
That's a great question. I've already talked to Crossway about a Surviving Religion 202 book, where I've thought about tackling more questions and then also tackling things like that, which is practical advice on what do you do in these conversations and so forth. I look back when I was a college student and cringe, if I could be honest, sometimes at what I thought was the best way to handle that. I think in just getting on my own case here, I was young and immature like anybody is at that stage. I felt obligated sort of morally to speak up, right? And I get that, and that's nothing wrong with that. But I kind of took that as like morally obligated to always speak up. And I was a bit of a pain in the side of probably numerous professors, like, well, this guy, please let it go, where I probably pushed too hard and probably talked too much. So there is always that person in the class who's that way, and you're like, dude, just let it go. You don't have to say it every time. Someone needed to say that to me. So my first piece of advice is you're not morally obligated as a Christian to always verbally object every time you see something wrong in the world. If that were true, you would do nothing but verbally object most of your life, right? It's like the person who comes late to bed and his wife's like, well, what were you doing? He goes, well, someone was wrong on the internet and I had to take care of it, right? Well, yeah, someone's always wrong on the internet, right? Someone's always wrong in class. Professors always say things they shouldn't say. Okay, so what does that mean? That means to be more strategic and patient about when to speak. Obviously, I can't dictate for any given student when that is, but look for a moment where you could politely and graciously say, but isn't it true there's a whole bunch of scholars that disagree there? Can we talk about that a little bit? I think just that kind of pushback is good. The other piece, appropriately timed, the other piece of advice I give is I would say the most fruitful opportunities a student has is actually not publicly battling with a professor. I find that rarely goes your way. They're just smarter, no more, they have the stage. You're just going to, almost 99% of the time, that's not going to go your way. Your better hope is to have the conversation after class with the students. That's, I think, where the fruit is. So go to a student and say, hey, what did you think about that lecture? Let's go grab a coffee. I'd love to hear what you thought about what he said. And there's your conversation starter. And it's not threatening. It's not like, isn't the professor an idiot? No. So what did you think about that? Let's go talk about it. Great question. Yes, in the back. Oh, love it. You read the book. Well done. You already get an A. Good job. Yeah, great question. Well, first, a couple clarifications. First of all, the Bible is pretty clear that God does not either sin himself or make anyone sin. So he's not culpable of personal sin, nor does he force a person to sin or make them sin. Here's what is true, though, is that lots of times we forget that people would sin a lot more if God didn't hold them back. Okay, and there's a word for this in theology. It's called common grace. So the Bible teaches that people are what we call totally depraved, which means we're sinners through and through. And if we're sinners through and through, sometimes people's objection is, well, if I'm a sinner through and through, why isn't everyone a serial killer? Why isn't everyone Adolf Hitler? Why isn't everyone just an awful person all the time? Why is it the old lady who lives next to me who's not a Christian seem nicer than most Christians I know? Because of common grace. Common grace is that God restrains sin in us so we're not as bad as we otherwise could be. But the Bible also indicates that sometimes people are so persistent on sinning, God removes that common grace and lets them go the way they would go otherwise. So God's not forcing them down that path. God's not making them sin, but he's removing his restraint, if you will, and letting them go down that path even further. And usually what that means is that God gives them over to their own destruction. It's a part of God's judgment, and the Bible picks up on this in a number of different places. So I think that is hard to handle, I know, and hard to understand, and sometimes we're like, why would God do that? But those are larger questions that we can continue to talk about, but I think the big takeaway is that God doesn't make a person sin, nor does he cause sin, and it doesn't violate their free will because they're headed down that path anyway, and God just simply lets go of his restraints. Great question. Someone read the book. Well done. What chapter was that, by the way? Do you remember?
It was on page 86.
Okay, page 86. All right, good. You even have the page number. All right. Other questions? Someone over here who's forcing his friend to raise his hand. That usually doesn't go well. All right, right here.
To your point of wise exposure instead of just isolation, any advice for parents with younger kids, 7 years old,
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it goes without saying. If you didn't hear the question, it's like, what do you do if your kids are really young? What's wise exposure look like there? And I think my broad answer was it'd probably be really limited, right? Because it's wise exposure. You're not trying to, I'm not going to set my 7-year-olds down and say, listen to this Bart Ehrman lecture. Tell me what you think. That's not going to help. But I think, you can help them understand basic stuff like why are some things right and some things wrong? Why do we, how would you think you would know what happened in the past? How could you ever get access to that information? What do you think about God doing a miracle? Now, of course, kids that age typically are more believing, right? They probably hasn't even dawned on them that there would be a reason not to believe. But I think you can gently and patiently do it. But I think as you're really thinking about it as the years tick by, more and more opportunities. So I don't have a particular set of advice for a 7-year-old, but I think the big takeaway is probably many, many less opportunities when they're young, and as time goes by, look for more and more opportunities as they continue to grow. All right. Yep. Yeah. Yep.
Where they're going through challenges in high school, where they're going through those challenges in college, and then when they get out of college, and they're starting to look at isolates and jobs, and you gotta pray more, pray.
Yeah, I mean, no doubt about it. I mean, there's no doubt that there's core things always in place we do for our kids. Prayer is certainly one of those things, and it's like the 3 rules of real estate: location, location, location. Right? It's like pray, pray, pray. Certainly that's the case. And I think that the caution I would give here tonight is that we want to do that, and we should do that, but I would say we wouldn't do only that. No parent would say, I'm only praying, never dialoguing with my kid. No, you can do both. So, yep. All right, maybe one more question as time ticks away here. Yep. Was the question about helping parents phrase the question or helping kids phrase the question? Okay. You're asking if there's a book or anything like that out there? Have you asking if there's a book or something like that? Yeah, I don't know that I do know that. I think one of the ways that kids pick up on the way to ask questions is by learning it from the way we do. They're at the end of the day, they're imitators, right? They're mimickers. And sometimes that's not good, right? When we realize, oh, why is my kid acting like that? And you're like, oh, because they're around me all the time, right? It's like, oh, they kind of remind me of me. And so sometimes that's bad, but sometimes it's good, right? So as much as we're able to learn to ask questions in a way that's not Richard Dawkins-like, they probably will eventually pick up on that themselves. But I don't know of a particular resource there. So, yep. Yep. Is that good? Anything else? All right. Thank you very much.